Okay, thanks so much for having me. This afternoon, I want to talk a little bit about my ongoing PhD research in Pictish symbols. Specifically today, I want to talk about the Grammatogeny, how the Pictish symbol script was invented. I will start by introducing the Pictish symbol system as a likely writing system. I'll provide some justification for this. I'll also provide justification for my treatment of it as an abugida. I will then present what I think is a plausible grammatogenic scenario for an abugida in first millennium Western Europe, where you might not expect to have an abugida. I'm going to argue that the grammatic structure is influenced from syllabic Turnian notes, that the graphetic structure, the design of the basic shapes, the design process is influenced from the Ogham script. And I'm going to argue that the intended original medium of use of the script was a pre-existing tattooing practice. Okay, but first, what are Pictish symbols and who are the Picts? The Picts were a 4th to 9th century, late antique, early medieval people of northern Britain, eastern and northern modern day Scotland. Their name, Picts, comes from the Latin term picti, meaning the painted ones, almost certainly relating to body art. They spoke a Brittonic language of the Celtic branch of Indo-European. The Pictish symbol system exhibits a really high degree of regularity over a large geographic region, as you can see in this map here. Largely, Pictish symbol inscriptions are preserved in monumental contexts, such as the undressed pillar stone and the relief-carved cross slab, but we also see Pictish symbol inscriptions on some portables, so you can see a silver plaque on the right there, and we also see Pictish symbols in cave wall contexts as well. Previously, most interpretations of Pictish symbols have been non-linguistic in nature, so relating to spiritual or cosmological or social or geographical concepts. Notably in the 1990s, there were a couple of explanations in terms of Pictish symbols as a narrowly defined writing system that mapped basic shapes to personal names or morphemes in diathematic personal names. Importantly, while some previous investigators have assessed the likelihood of phonography for Pictish symbols, no one has explored what a phonographic writing system would look like in terms of Pictish symbols. And this is one of the main threads of my PhD research. Okay, so just to justify my treatment of the symbol system as a linguistic symbol system, I call it a writing system because it's clearly treated at the time as a writing system. So we find archaeological analogs for many of the contexts of Pictish symbol inscriptions that are known writing systems. So the most common contexts for inscriptions are these undressed pillar stones. Around the same time and in the same geographic region, we see inscribed pillar stones in the Ogham script and in the Latin script. So here's a really nice archaeological analog, and the textual content of these inscriptions in the known scripts are personal names. We get biscriptal pillar stones that are inscribed in Pictish symbols and Ogham, and we also get biscriptals in Latin and Ogham. We have stones with this distinctive Cairo cross adjacent to Pictish symbol texts, and we get the same thing adjacent to Latin script texts, again, personal names. At a later period in the 8th, 9th centuries, we get relief carved slabs with Pictish symbol inscriptions on the narrow edge. We get the same thing with the Ogham script and with the Latin script. Known writing systems in these contexts preserving personal names. And there's a nice little archaeological analog for our silver plaque that we saw before in this 3rd century Romano-British votive plaque, which has an inscription in the Latin script preserving personal names. Okay, in addition to these archaeological analogs, there are a few systemic features that I want to draw your attention to. So the Pictish symbol system is clearly used in multiple functions. So in the later relief carved period, we see an increase in the human figurative art. And in several instances of this, we have Pictish symbol texts adjacent to human figures in a way consistent with labeling with a personal name. At the other end of the spectrum, we have this inscribed ox bone, which is potentially coming from a gaming context. On one side of it, we see one Pictish symbol. On the reverse, we see another Pictish symbol. It's unclear what this is doing, but it's doing something very different to the labeling function. So we've got at least a plurality of functions for that. The Pictish symbol system exhibits all of what people have claimed are necessary conditions to be a writing system. So although most texts are short, where we get longer texts, we do see linearity for what it's worth. There's a high degree of repetition in the system. And in cave wall contexts, which I'd argue are less formal than monumental contexts, we do actually see a degree of cursivity of some of the basic shapes. Of course, many of you, some of you might be aware that there are statistical arguments both for and against Pictish symbols as a narrowly defined writing system. I think we've got enough to go on with just the archaeological and the systemic features for now. But let's have a look at the symbol inventory. So the way that I've described the grapheme inventory is in terms of between 58 and 66 graphemes. I'm happy to be drawn on my argumentation for formulating the graphemes in question time. So I'd argue you have a series of 15 plain basic shapes. Many of these have corresponding rod modified basic shapes, and many of them have corresponding edge modified basic shapes. Now, together, I call these the abstract graphemes, and you'll see that within the cells of this paradigm, you've got geometric figures and you've got non-naturalistic zoomorphic figures. I can go into the details later if you'd like. In addition to these abstract graphemes, we also have what I call animal graphemes, and we also have object graphemes. Within inscriptions, it's clear that the abstract and animal graphemes are operating in the same graphematic module. They're behaving in the same way. So I call them main graphemes. And the objects are clearly doing something very different. They're not interacting within inscriptions in the same way. So I call them auxiliary graphemes. At this point, it's really enlightening to make a few cross-linguistic comparisons. If we compare just the abstract graphemes with another known writing system, this time from the Philippines, the Hananuo script, which I think we heard a little bit about when Pippa presented, has roughly the same number of graphemes, but more importantly, they're arranged in a very similar way. We have a series of 16 plain basic shapes, corresponding basic shapes, corresponding graphemes with one type of modifier, and then corresponding graphemes with another type of modifier. We know that the Hananuo writing system is an abugida. So is it possible that this is kind of reinforcing evidence for the notion of Pictish symbols as syllabographic writing? If we take this hypothesis into inscriptions themselves, we get a little bit more confirming evidence. In the archaeological context that I showed you, we're expecting the content, the textual content of Pictish symbols to be personal names. We know a lot of Pictish personal names from manuscript sources. And from around the 6th century onwards, you'll see from the top graph that the majority of Pictish personal names have 2 syllables. From the bottom graph, you can see that the majority of symbol texts have 2 main symbols in them as well. So texts are no shorter than we'd expect them to be if they're representing what we think they're representing, if that makes sense. But syllabography in first millennium Western Europe is a bit unexpected. Why might we have this? Well, we do have this notion of the primacy of the syllable. We know that syllabography is involved in many ancient, modern, sophisticated, unsophisticated grammatogenies in unrelated contexts. There is a question of complex syllable structure, though. While there are a few Pictish names that conform to an open syllable structure like Kana, Bili, or Geda, many Pictish names have coders or a restricted type of complex onset or vowel initials or diphthongs. But we have Amalianana Desikan reminding us that the strings that syllabaries encode are usually actually a poor match for the inventory of syllables, and many of the languages for which syllabaries are used contain more complex syllables. So we needn't be we needn't disparage this theory just yet. The Pictish symbol grammatogeny, because of the systematicity, I've argued that it almost certainly occurred at a single point in time. So does that mean that a Pict independently invented the concept of an abugida as well as inventing the Pictish symbol script? I'd argue that he or she needn't have done that. So Pictish symbols with abugidic relations, I'd argue, may derive from syllabic Turonian notes. So for those of you unfamiliar with Turonian notes, it's a shorthand system used in late antiquity in imperial, ecclesiastical, bureaucratic settings. It's used largely for the transcription of speeches, sermons, proceedings of church councils. Really importantly, there is physical evidence of the use of Turonian notes in northern Britain by 100 AD. There's so little evidence for Turonian notes, of late antique Turonian notes, so it's really special that we have this confirmation that this system was being used in northern Britain 100 miles away from Pictland. It's traditionally been described in terms of three systems. System A being a logographic system that developed around the 1st century BC or AD. It's possible that there were originally around 5,000, but by the time the Carolingians started compiling 8th century compendia of these notes, that there were around 13,000. System B, which may have arisen around the 2nd century AD, was syllabographic. And then system C is the kind of 8th century iteration of that syllabographic type. So the division of system A, B, and C is traditional, but I think people agree now that there was almost certainly quite a high degree of system mixing, even from an early period of use. And if you have a look at the logographic basic shapes, they're based on the syllabographic basic shapes in many instances. So here is an example of a text written in Turonian notes. You'll see that while the heading is written in the Latin script, all of the following proverbs are written in Turonian notes. There's a 9th century example, but that's what Turonian notes might look like. Specifically, syllabic Turonian notes, so that system B that I talked about before. I think there's a really good argument for analyzing this as an abugida. So if you have a look at the basic shapes that I've selected from the larger infantry in the paradigm to the right, you'll see across the paradigm, you can see a core element that's shared. And then you can see down the rows, down the columns of the paradigm, you can see a shared modification. So for the A vowel, you can see an arch. For the E vowel, you can see a horizontal, well, a bar. For the O modification, you can see a loop. And for the U modification, you can see kind of upwards tick looking thing. I think there's some evidence that you can analyze the E vowel as being inherent. The graphemes for be, ke, and de are identical to their consonantal segmental equivalents. So in a sense, the E vowel in these contexts might be inherent. So we've got the notion of an abugida there. So it's certainly alpha syllabic, and likely it can be analyzed in terms of an abugida. And kind of in addition to that, the te and we are also identical to their segmental counterparts, but they have a kind of little optional dot that we also see with the ke. So I think there's good reason to argue for that. There are also examples from manuscripts of uniquely the syllabic system in use. So here we've got some horizontal arrangements from this 8th century manuscript. I'll draw your attention to the last one, Wigilia having 4 syllables and this containing 4 basic shapes. It's neat that we also in marginalia get vertical arrangements without a rotation of the basic shapes themselves. And I really want to draw your attention to this last one, which is a disyllabic personal name written using two basic shapes. So this is exactly what I'm proposing for Pictish symbols. So if the inventor of Pictish symbols knew syllabic Turonian notes, creating an algorithmic writing system would be a really simple matter. The individuals who knew Turonian notes in the late antique Roman Empire were administrative, so notaries, acceptores. In many instances, they were enslaved individuals, but they were very valuable individuals. And historically, we see them coming from, we see males and females working in this capacity. So the invention of Pictish symbols by someone who knew Turonian notes is consistent with military administrative use on the Roman frontier, where Picts were the adversaries. But I think you'll agree, Pictish symbols look very different from Turonian notes. And I'll argue that some of that is because of the way that the basic shapes were designed. I think this comes from the Olm script. So brief introduction to the Olm script for anyone who doesn't know. So the Olm script is largely preserved from Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Man, and Cornwall, Devon. The classical Olm period is between the 5th and 7th century. The invention of the script itself, maybe a century, a little bit more beforehand. Some of the features of the system, it is alphabetic. It's mostly read upwards, up an aris of an undressed stone, so an edge. And it's mostly inscribed on these pillar stones, and the textual content of this is mostly personal names. We've got a short inscription here on a very tall stone, and I'll draw your attention to the fact that even though it's a short inscription, it's over 1 meter long, so it's short but big. Okay, how are the consonants, the 15 consonants of the Olm script formed? Well, we start with one of 3 basic shapes, either 3 elementary forms, either to the right, to the left, or across the stem line, this aris in many instances. To get 3 more, we double the elementary forms. To get 3 more, we triple, quadruple, and quintuple the elementary forms. And this gives us all of the consonants of the core Olm script. I've argued previously that this is also how you get the abstract Pictish basic shapes. So we start with one of 3 elementary forms, either a circle, rectangle, or arch. We double it, we triple it. In this instance, we don't go further. We then take roughly half of the content to get our 4th column there. And to get the 5th column, we take that half, copy it, rotate it, and glom it on itself in what I call the reflex degree. But essentially, we've got a similar way of filling out this grapheme paradigm. So I think you'll agree that, so we know, for a start, we know that Pictish symbols and Olm were used by the same people. There are several biscriptals that appear to have contemporary inscriptions. If the inventor of Pictish symbols knew Olm, then the process of deriving Olm characters is self-evident. The same process, I would argue, was used for deriving the plain abstract Pictish symbol basic shapes. But again, so just like Turonian notes and Pictish symbols look different, you'll also agree that Olm and Pictish symbols look quite distinct. And I think one of the key reasons for this is the intended original medium of use. And I have argued that the Pictish symbol system, the niche of use of that, was the pre-existing tattooing practice. So we know that Olm was in use in Pictland. We know that the Latin script was in use in Pictland. So why would we invent another writing system? Well, I think that each of these scripts existed in its own social and sociolinguistic niche. And I think you can see a little bit of this from the preserved portables. I think the Pictish symbol script occupies this elite, ornamental, sociolinguistic niche. So the portables that have Pictish symbol inscriptions, we have this silver chain with inscribed terminus. We've got this silver crossbow brooch. We've got this silver plaque that we've seen, and we've got this ornamental bronze two-sided plate as well. So, you know, I'm not the first to suggest that these portables are associated with elite contexts. The Latin script, we know that it's associated with learned intellectual contexts and can accommodate all text types. From this Latin inscribed portable from within the political sphere of the Picts has an overt ecclesiastic reference. So we know that it's playing in that ecclesiastic space. The Olm script portables from Pictland, however, seem to be from a different niche. So here we have some common practical Olm portables. We've got two examples of knife handles, and that last example of a spindle whirl for creating wool. So they look like the portables are occupying different niches. In addition to that, I think there's good historic evidence that the Picts tattooed themselves. This observation led two 20th century scholars to claim that the Pictish symbols were, the Pictish tattooing involved the Pictish symbol system. I've argued that there's, in addition to that historic evidence, there's good graphetic evidence that Pictish symbol basic shape design is consistent with tattooing as the primary medium of use. There's even some evidence, some have suggested that this practice of tattooing persisted through to the end of the 8th century. And it's around the 8th century that we see the creation of the Book of Kells, which some have suggested has a Pictish provenance. And you know, some scholars have also argued that some individuals within the Book of Kells showed either partial or full nudity, and they show designs that look like tattooing that could be individuals bearing Pictish tattoos. If Pictish tattoos involve Pictish symbols, Isidore of Seville's 7th century description corroborates some of these associations. So Isidore says of the Picts, whose name is taken from their bodies because an artisan with tiny point of a pin and the juice squeezed from a native plant tricks them out with scars to serve as identifying marks, and their nobility are distinguished by their tattooed limbs. So we've got some corroboration of, well, the writing implement, but also this social niche that the tattooing was associated with a particular class. So in a Pictish cultural milieu, the inventor of the Pictish symbol system was certainly familiar with Pictish abstract and animal tattooing, at the latest by the 3rd century. The choice of graphetic features, which differs so much from Olm, Turonian notes, Latin, reflects elite tattooing as the primary medium of use intended by the creator of the script. So essentially what the scenario that I'm describing looks like is that in northern Britain, we have the Latin script being introduced in around the 1st century, syllabic Turonian notes diffusing throughout the 2nd century, and a pre-existing tattooing that was at the latest the 3rd century. The Olm script, which may have developed in the 4th century, derives its grammatic structure, these alphabetic relations with phonemes, from the Latin script, but the picture is a little bit more complicated for the Pictish symbols. So I'd argue that the grammatic structure, the alphabetic relations, are derived from syllabic Turonian notes, that the design process of the basic shapes is influenced from Olm, and that the intended medium of use was tattooing. It just so happens that throughout the 5th to 7th centuries, all of these distinctions were kind of flattened because all of these writing systems were used in the same monument type, that's inscribed pillar stones, which is where we see Latin and Olm and Pictish symbols, and Pictish symbols. We see a kind of this use across the same monument type of all of these scripts, which belies their original diversity of use. And that's actually me, I think. I do. That's actually the kind of topic of my thesis. The problem with the Pictish Olm is that it's extremely difficult to interpret. So there are essentially no good interpretations of the 2-3 score Olm inscriptions within Pitland. There are some guesses at what the content of each of them might be. I actually think that because I haven't at all presented about my decipherment methodology, but because it doesn't depend on the interpretation of any of the Pictish Olm, I actually think that there could be a mutually reinforcing kind of factor once we have a highest likelihood decipherment model for Pictish symbols, that between the two of them, so for example, the Bransbutt biscriptal that we saw before, that had kind of Olm up one side and then the two Pictish symbols, we know the segmental value for the Olm inscription. If we have a highest likelihood value for the Pictish symbol inscription, we might be able to actually interpret the Olm better.
My question was about tattooing. Was this found in other parts of the British Isles as well? And why do you think language was so important? So just symbolism, if it is actually decipherable.
Yeah, great question. So classical sources describe various types of body art within the British Isles. So I mean, we as early as the kind of middle of the 1st century BC, we get Julius Caesar's description of the kind of the overall body woad painting. I've taken a subset of these sources that specifically talk about scars, that talk about what we imagine is actually tattooing. The sources that mention these particular types of body art are restricted to kind of northern Britain. The other question was why language would be important. I want to be really specific about what I'm claiming. I don't think the 3rd century description of Herodian saying that they tattoo animals and shapes, I don't think that by the 3rd century necessarily that's the Pictish symbol system. I think this is describing the fact that they were tattooing they had a previous tradition of tattooing that at some point was used as a kind of inspiration for incorporating language in a writing system. I think the systematicity of the basic shapes argues that it's a writing system. So at some point, someone has sat down and created the system and incorporated language. Why they would want to incorporate language in particular? Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's
the tattoos are symbolic.
Well, so I think that there was certainly animal and geometric tattooing before the invention of the Pictish symbol system, but I would argue that the intended medium of use of the Pictish symbol system was this medium. So they needn't have originally had that relation to linguistic units. Yeah.
Mentioned that the graphetic properties of the symbol system are congruent with tattooing as a medium. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I presented this previously at the Views conference. I think that there's various graphetic properties throughout the script, like the inventory of basic shapes that's are consistent with this. I think one of the key ones that I've talked about is the intrinsic versus extrinsic symmetry. So the intrinsic symmetry is when you either reflect or you rotate the basic shape and it forms the same shape. Extrinsic symmetry is where we have two basic shapes that belong to two different graphemes. And if we rotate one basic shape, we actually get a basic shape that's a different grapheme, right? So the Olm script, you'll notice that if you rotate the whole first series, you get the whole second series. So direction of interpretation of the Olm script is really, really important. If I, for example, have a tattoo on my arm and I read it from one direction, I'm going to read the segments in a particular order, but I'm also going to identify each of the consonants in a particular way. If you read it from the other direction, you'll interpret it in the reverse order, but you'll also misinterpret a bunch of the consonants. That's not true of a writing system that has a high degree of intrinsic symmetry. And in fact, the basic shapes of Pictish symbols have a really high degree of rotational and reflectional intrinsic symmetry.
So the graphetic properties then, not the tool, but the medium being the body and unpredictable rotation in these compared to stone.
Yes. So the Pictish symbol arrangements are also capable of conforming to irregularities in a writing surface in a way that Olm can't. I think there is also a parallelism in the tools that are being used and the method of production, but we can talk about that much.
Yeah. We have two questions from online. If you look at these.
So the first one, I wondered about the pronunciation of Olm. I would have assumed a hard G as in Ogmore or organ. I'm from Pembrokeshire. Hello. Where there are a few examples, but there I've read Olm. Oh, sorry, I can't even. Ogum. Perhaps the silent G is an Irish pronunciation, or perhaps there are multiple pronunciations. Great comment. So it really depends what period. You can pronounce it however you'd like. For example, long story short, but I tend to say Ogham because that's the modern Irish and modern Scottish Gaelic pronunciation. In the 8th, 9th century, you would have said Ogham. In Proto-Celtic, you would have said something more along the lines of the kind of hard G, like an actual girth. So this is essentially a process of lenition. But I think in general, just say it how you like. And then the other one is also about the pronunciation of Ogham, Ogham, or Ogham. Yeah.
And if anyone is hungry for lunch, feel free to leave.
Yeah. Please eat.
To ask you about the relationship between the abstract science, you put it in animal science, because you mentioned, if I recall correctly, that they behave similarly in the script as opposed to the objects. But whereas the abstract science have this, I think, very convincingly demonstrated schematic quality to them, like a procedurally generated whatever, the animals of course don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of interesting to me that they behave similarly. So if you have any comments on that aspect.
Yeah, so when I say they behave similarly, I mean at the level, in a kind of mesographetic arrangement. So, for example, this, I'm not sure if you can actually interpret this inscription. There's a goose, and then there's a rectangle at the top. So they're playing in the same space when we look at these texts that are largely two main symbols. This one doesn't have an object grapheme. Usually, if it did, I'd expect it to be smaller and at the bottom, probably a little bit to the right, but it needn't be. So that there's a large degree of variability in terms of the relative emplacement of the auxiliary grapheme, the object basic shapes in relation to the kind of main ones. They're playing in the same space, essentially. Yeah. What that means for their interpretability, one of my working hypotheses is that we have these abstract graphemes that are relating to open CV syllables. This doesn't give any way of representing, say, vowel initial. or CBC syllables. We know, I mean, we can reconstruct the Proto-Celtic forms of what we'd expect for, goose or for stag. And a lot of the stems that we'd expect are kind of CBC. So that's something to think about when we're talking about them here.
Thank you.
Fascinating talk about questions. One is why this is small. Why the term basic shapes? Because similar for graph. Second is why Abugida? Why maybe I just didn't get it yet, but it seems like the evidence for why Abugida is that there's some internal structure that reveals some amount of decomposability, and Turonian nodes seem to have a similar structure. Is that the evidence for why Abugida is probably the most likely system?
So why basic shapes? I suppose the easy answer is because the framework for my PhD adopts the framework described by Dimitrios. So basic shapes being an analog of kind of the phone at a kind of phonetic level. Anyway, so I'm taking that framework kind of as a whole. The argument for Abugida, it's got so the argument for syllabography, the grapheme inventory is around the right size. The symbol length, the symbol inscription lengths are what we'd expect for the content that we expect. For an Abugida in particular, so for an alpha syllabary, the consistent modification across the plain basic shapes argues, I think, for an alpha syllabary. And then the fact that one of the settings has no modification, I think, argues for an Abugida, that we've got an inherent vowel for one of them. If we wanted to argue against Abugida, but still kind of an alpha syllabary, we'd expect that if we had an unmodified basic shape, that somehow these might result in kind of longer inscriptions. There's in the majority of cases we've got two, and we've got two syllables. So the working hypothesis is that there is a vowel in the unmodified grapheme. It's just inherent in some way.
Or is it just strictly?
Well, the only candidates would be the animal graphemes or the object graphemes. My working hypothesis for the object graphemes, and other people have suggested this as well, is that they're not actually, they're kind of providing context for the inscription. I don't really want to say determinative or classifier, but they're, because you do get inscriptions that only have, say, an object basic shape, but something along those lines. So we're really restricted to the animals. If you suspect that we have animals operating logographically and the expected content is personal names, you can look into the known etymology of Pictish, of Celtic personal names, and look to see if there are names with those animals in them. There's plenty of Celtic personal names that involve like badger slayer and whatnot. There's very few that involve fish, but fish is the salmon is the most common kind of animal grapheme. So you have to, I've assessed the likelihood that it's logography based on the etymology of personal names, and it doesn't seem viable.
Awesome. Thank you so much.